Whenever you're okay. Hi, peoples. You all know why you're here. For the event, Is Christianity True? The format of the talk, the event's going to be, we're going to have a short conversation for about 10 minutes. Max is going to give a talk for about 30 minutes, and then we're going to have a Q&A at the end with a short break in the middle for people to kind of organize their thoughts. We're going to have some items screen. Move on to the sliders.
Yeah.
Anyhow, we're going to have a Slido. And so if people want to send in questions, you can have the link at the beginning so that as you think of them, you can type them in. And we'll get them at the end and ask. Also, if your questions are a little bit longer, because Slido has a word limit, my phone number will on the screen also. So if you have a longer question that you'd really like to ask, please do text me as well. And so I'll keep an eye on both sides. I think, yeah. So this is the Slido. So if people want to, I'm going to give a minute so that if people want it, yeah, there's the thing. The QR code will be around at the end as well. So, yeah. Okay. I guess that's everyone. So, yeah, welcome. And let's give a big round of applause to our wonderful. So I think the first question that we'd like to ask a philosopher is, what exactly is it that a philosopher does? I mean, do you sit around in an armchair thinking about the universe, or do you meditate on a rock? You know, what is it that you do?
Yeah, that's a great question. And thank you very much for having me. So what does a philosopher do? I think, you know, the very question of what is philosophy is a philosophical question. And so because philosophers love to kind of unpick things and sort of dismantle ideas that we might take for granted, even that very question itself is not straightforward to answer, the question of what is philosophy. The American philosopher Alvin Plantinga gave a definition of philosophy as thinking really hard. And I think he was being a bit tongue-in-cheek, but I think he also kind of had a point that it is genuinely quite difficult to come up with a definition of what philosophy is, as it is actually to come up with a definition of what science is. And there's a long history of trying to do that. And every time someone has put forward a definition of what science is, that other people have come forward with objections and counter examples. So that's a big caveat really before I try and give my own kind of account. I don't know, I wouldn't call it a definition of what philosophy is. So I think that philosophy is the attempt to use reason to answer those questions about the world that can't straightforwardly be answered just through empirical methods. So let me say a little bit more about that. So what do I mean by using reason? So by using reason, I mean really a kind of set of tools that are available to all human beings in principle. And you talked about armchairs. Yes, these are methods and tools that one can in principle do from sitting in an armchair. So I think it's using tools like analyzing concepts really carefully, even kind of looking at the way that we use language, and trying to come up with definitions of words, trying to get those definitions really precise, sort of constructing arguments. And if anyone here has read philosophy, you may know that often philosophers will lay out arguments in careful steps, like premise 1, premise 2, therefore conclusion. And so a lot of the work of a philosopher is that kind of quite painstaking work of just trying to make things as clear as possible and as precise as possible, in order that we can sort of analyze arguments and see where there might be flaws in those arguments, and see if those arguments can be kind of adjusted to make them stronger. You'll also notice that philosophers will often use things like thought experiments. So there's a famous thought experiment that's called the trolley problem. It's often presented in introductory textbooks to philosophy. So the idea is that you're asked the question, what should you do in this situation? There's a trolley or a train, whatever, that's going along a track, and it's going to, if nothing is done, it will plow into 5 people and kill them. But there's another track that goes off, and there's a switch. And if you were to flip that switch, the train would go off on that other track, and it would kill just 1 person. And the question is, should you do nothing and let 5 people die, or should you actively move this switch and then 1 person will die? And so that's a thought experiment that philosophers use to essentially to explore ethical concepts in that case, and to really kind of force ourselves to confront certain dilemmas in which competing sets of intuitions are in conflict with each other. And so, of course, all of these sorts of tools that I'm describing, analyzing arguments, using thought experiments, and so on, can be applied to the question of God and whether God exists. And of course, there is this whole long history of philosophers thinking about the existence of God and putting forward arguments for God's existence and arguments against God's existence.
So, I mean, speaking about God and your belief in God, you mentioned in the past that you grew up in a Christian household, but that by the time you'd gone to university, you'd essentially become an agnostic. What exactly convinced you in particular, at university?
Yeah, that's
and why had you become an agnostic?
Yes. I think that in essence, the kind of way I engaged with Christianity by the time I was kind of beginning, teenage years, was that I would just sort of pray to God occasionally if I wanted something. And so I essentially sort of treated God like a vending machine. And I suppose that at some point, I just began to think that the vending machine wasn't giving me what I wanted often enough, and I genuinely just wasn't that interested. I didn't become a kind of deeply philosophical atheist. I was just not particularly engaged or interested, and it wasn't something I took seriously or saw as being relevant. So yeah, then to your question, what changed my mind? I think that when I went to university, in my halls of residence, there were I became friends with some Christians in my halls of residence, and there were 2 things basically that struck me. One was that there was something about the depth of the friendships I saw that was really interesting to me in comparison to some other friendships I had that were mostly based around basically drinking. And it seemed to me that the friendships that these Christians had, there was something deeper there that attracted me. And I was curious why that was. And the other thing was that I came into contact for the first time with some Christians who presented the idea that there was evidence for Christianity and that there was an intellectual case for thinking that Christianity was true. And this was not something I had come across before. I had assumed that the only reason one would be a Christian was because that's how, you know, one had been brought up, and that it kind of gave you some sense of purpose and comfort and so on. But you know, it had not occurred to me that there was sort of intellectual reasons for thinking that Christianity was true. And so I was compelled and led to start to look into that for myself, both in terms of philosophical reasons for thinking there might be a God, but also historical reasons for taking seriously Jesus, and not just, you know, that Jesus existed, but also evidence pertaining to this idea that after Jesus was crucified, that he was resurrected. And I was particularly surprised that that there was some quite compelling evidence there to be grappled with, when you know, I had previously assumed that it was just kind of on a par with Greek myths.
So, I mean, the big question is, why is it that one should want Christianity to be true? And because Christianity and religion in general has been used over the years for so many bad things. And
Yeah.
so one could think, you know, why do they even want to tell us about it when it's been used for such terrible things?
Yeah.
So why should we want it to be true? And why did they want to tell you about it?
So the first thing I think that needs to be said there is that I don't think there's any point answering this question by trying to play down the awful things that have been done in the name of Christianity. And I think I would want to go even further than that and say it's not just that there were people who used Christianity, but they weren't themselves really Christians. I think we have to be honest and say there have been, and even are in the world, people who really sincerely think they are acting in the name of Jesus and yet doing terrible things. And you I'm sure familiar with examples of that, things like the Crusades, you know, the witch trials, and many other examples could be given. So then the question is, why think that despite all of that awfulness, that Christianity is somehow good news? And I think the answer has to be the person of Jesus. What's really interesting is that, you know, even the likes of Richard Dawkins and so on, you know, the sort of modern day prominent kind of cultural critics of Christianity often have a high degree of respect for Jesus's ethical teaching. And actually, some of you may know that there's been a book written recently by a historian called Tom Holland, called Dominion. It's I'm partway through it, but it's really worth reading. What's interesting about that is Tom Holland is a historian who has written about kind of the great empires of the past, and he used to maintain that ideas of being charitable to the poor and valuing the weak in society, and the idea of you know, loving others whether or not that, you know, they're able to help you in return. Tom Holland said he used to believe that all of these ideas could be found in lots of different streams of thought going back historically, including the Greeks and the Romans and so on, and that there's nothing specially Christian about these ideas. But then he said that he really began to change his mind, that the more he studied the civilizations, especially Greece and Rome, which were, you know, was the cultural Christianity emerged into the world, the more he studied those, the more convinced he became that these ideas of care for the weak, of charity, of self-giving love and so on, were not ideas that you could find in the Greeks and the Romans. and that really it was something absolutely revolutionary about, not just about Jesus' teaching, but the fact that at the heart of the Christian message is the idea that the creator of the whole universe valued the weak, the slaves, the poor, and so on, so much that he would become a human being and would actually die the death that the Roman Empire reserved for the lowest of the low, the kind of criminal scum, the rebels, and that by God being willing to embrace that, he therefore elevated the lowest kind of class of society, and the way that affirms the value of the weak. Tom Holland argues is absolutely radical and revolutionary, and that all of our ideas today about care for the poor, charity, universal human rights, that every human being has dignity regardless of class, gender, race, ethnicity, sexuality, and so on. And I think he's made a really compelling case for this. And I think that is profoundly good news. And what I would, the final thing I wanted to say on this point is that you say, well, why is it that I, as a Christian, should be particularly upset about the crimes done in the name of Christianity? It's because it's not that the people who do these things are taking Jesus too seriously. It's that they don't take Jesus seriously enough. And it's that the reason I'm able to see these things as awful is precisely because they are in such contradiction to not just the teachings, but the very kind of life and being of Jesus himself.
So, yeah, I guess thank you for those answers. And I think it's time to invite you to give a talk for us. So let's all give a round of applause again.
I'm curious about you.
That's great. Okay. So much. Great. Well, thank you again for coming to this talk. I'll actually possibly try and be a bit briefer than half an hour so that there's a good amount of time for questions. So yeah, my title that I've been asked to speak to is Christianity True? So I think I want to start by saying that it's not actually necessarily obvious that this is the right way to think about Christianity. As I said, when I was a teenager, I had assumed that the reason that someone would be a Christian was because it was sort of something they'd been brought up with, or it was something they kind of found comforting and so on. And actually, it wasn't until I started to seriously investigate Christianity for myself as a 19-year-old that it became quite clear to me that actually the only reason I would want to accept Christianity or reject it was on the basis of whether it was true or false. So I think I want to try my best to align myself with what's true. And I think we all do on some deep level. So, Christianity may or may not be beneficial to society. It may or may not have psychological benefits. But what I care about first and foremost is whether or not it's true. But before we talk about Christianity specifically, I want to kind of try and zoom out. In philosophy, one of the major branches is called epistemology. This is a term you may well have heard before. So the Greek word episteme means knowledge. So epistemology is the theory of knowledge, and it asks questions like, what is knowledge? And how much knowledge do we have? And so the reason I think it's good to start here is that I think sometimes we come to these kind of debates about religion with the sort of assumption that we know a lot about the world. And I think that, particularly kind of when you look at the new atheism in the late 2000s, Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, and so on, I think a lot of that kind of very confident skepticism can start with a posture of great confidence that we are able to know all sorts of things about the world. So I just want to make a few remarks about this question. How do we figure out what's true? And I want to kind of slightly destabilize the idea that we can have lots of knowledge about the world, or at least kind of try to open up to you some of the challenges that there are in the field of epistemology. Starting with the challenge of radical skepticism. And actually, with all of these things, often philosophers are actually just kind of formalizing and trying to make really precise things that we are intuitively aware of. I don't know if you've ever had the thought that, when you have dreams, they can sometimes be very convincing, and when you're in the dream, it can seem so real. And so that might generate the worry that, well, what about if right now, everything seems so real and convincing, but how would I be able to tell that I'm not dreaming right now? Yes, it's fine to say that, after you've woken up, the dream sort of somehow becomes clearly an illusion, but when you're in the dream, it doesn't feel like an illusion. So the challenge of radical skepticism is basically kind of giving voice to this worry that I think we all have had at some point in our lives, is how can we actually know anything? We just go about our daily lives as though, we're completely sure that, there's a real world outside of our minds, that you in this lecture theatre are all kind of real people. You all have minds just like me. You're not just figments or projections of my imagination. But philosophers, as I said, want to kind of problematize and question all of these deep assumptions. This cartoon in the middle is a brain in a vat. It's a brain being fed with nutrients and being stimulated to have experiences as if it's walking out in the sunshine, but really it's not. It's completely under an illusion about its surroundings. And of course, like, there are many films that explore these concepts, things like The Matrix, or more recently, Inception, where there's a whole question of can we ever reach sort of base reality, or are we just inside dreams within dreams within dreams, and so on. And the French philosopher in the 17th century, René Descartes, famously said that the only thing he could be sure of was that he existed. I think, therefore I am. He thought that actually when you really kind of bottom things out, we can't be sure of anything except that it appears to me that I'm having these experiences, but I can't be sure whether those experiences are really tracking what's out there. Another thing that I think we need to kind of be mindful of is that we are massively dependent for our knowledge of the world on each other's testimony. Just try and think for a minute about how much of what you know has come to you only through your own five senses and not through relying on what other people have told you. Just try to think about how much you could know about the world if you weren't allowed to rely on anyone's testimony at all. And I take it's really a tiny percent of everything we know. We are massively dependent in all sorts of ways on each other for what we know about the world. Or to put it another way, we're not islands. We're not epistemic islands who are kind of self-sufficient. The Scottish 18th century philosopher Thomas Reid was very interested in this topic, and there was a strong tendency in the philosophers of the Enlightenment, people like Descartes and Hume, to want to be very self-sufficient, to want to be able to say, I am the arbiter of everything, and I don't need to rely on anyone else to figure out what reality is like. And Thomas Reid really wanted to strongly push back against that and say, actually, no, if we would be in a hopeless situation if we couldn't rely on each other's testimony. And he says, I'll read out the quote, he says, it's evident that in the matter of testimony, the balance of human judgment is by nature inclined to the side of belief. So what he means is that we have a kind of natural tendency to accept other people's testimony. And he says that if it was not so, no proposition that is uttered in discourse would be believed until it was examined and tried by reason. And most people would be unable to find reasons for believing the thousandth part of what is told them. So in other words, if before you could accept any claim that someone tells you about the world, you had to investigate it for yourself, and using just your own five senses, you would be unable to find reasons for even a thousandth of what you actually believe. Here's another observation, which is that, philosophers love to be able to formalize arguments and lay out their reasons very nicely, even sometimes with formal logic, as in the top right-hand corner. But the reality is that actually, it seems to me anyway, that the evidence we have for many of the things we care the most about is really difficult to express in the form of neat, tidy arguments. So if you think about the evidence you have that, your parent or your girlfriend or boyfriend or partner loves you, it's actually a much more of a kind of subtle patchwork of considerations, of sort of observations and of body language and facial expressions, of a certain kind of experiences and memories, and little kind of subtle inferences, and none of those things probably taken on their own would really be good enough evidence. But it's somehow when all of these things come together, and it's really difficult to sort of formalize how that happens, but somehow this patchwork of considerations comes together to convince us of something. And what I want to say is that I think that is how things are when it comes to choosing a worldview, a view of what reality is like as a whole. I don't think it's a matter of any single argument convincing us. I think it's a matter of a patchwork of considerations, some of which can be very subtle and which can include experiences and intuitions, all coming together to convince us that reality is probably a certain way. Another observation is that there aren't knockdown arguments for any substantive view about any important topic in philosophy. And by knockdown, I mean sort of arguments that just everyone can see and agree are convincing. And really, when you look across all the different topics that philosophers are debating today, it really isn't possible to find any argument or view that, other than very kind of trivial sort of minutiae, it is very difficult to find any view about any question, whether that be kind of the nature of the relationship between the mind and the body, ethics, the trolley problem, for example. It's really difficult to find any argument in philosophy where everyone says, oh, clearly this is a successful argument, and clearly this view is true and is backed by successful arguments. So, sometimes you will find books, especially written by popular level authors, which will say things like, well, as we know, all of the arguments for God's existence are a failure. Well, the first thing about those sorts of books is often that they have not really generally done their homework and studied the latest and most sophisticated versions of the argument for God. But another thing is that there's a bit of a double standard there, in that, as I said, that the idea that there are arguments for other views in philosophy which everyone agrees are successful is just not the case. So we shouldn't be surprised if there are knockdown arguments for God's existence either. So final thing I want to say here is that when we weigh up different worldviews, where a worldview is kind of a theory of everything, a theory of what there is, what exists, and the basis for morality, and of what there will be, of whether there is a prospect for an afterlife and so on. A worldview is a theory of all those things. When we are weighing up different worldviews and trying to choose one, we should be looking at how well they account for all of the evidence, which includes types of evidence that are harder to quantify. As I said earlier, I think that in reality, when we think about some of the things that we care the most about, and I gave us an example, sort of interpersonal relationships and the question of whether you're loved by someone, the evidence we have is such that it's quite difficult to formalize it. And this is a quote from an American philosopher, Paul Draper, who is, I think, an agnostic. But in this passage, he is expressing the idea that when we think about the universe and some of the most striking features of the universe, and he's particularly thinking of things like the phenomenon of consciousness, something I'll talk about shortly, the phenomenon of cosmic fine-tuning, the phenomenon of morality. What Paul Draper wants to say is that if, yes, it's fine to come in and try and give explanations which reduce these phenomena and say they're not really what we think, it's something really a bit less impressive. But the point he wants to make here is that if we do that with too many different striking phenomena, it starts to become implausible, because we're almost saying that our cognitive faculties are systematically being deceived. And if we say that, then we might be undercutting the very basis for all our reasoning. So I'll read out the quote. He says that the more phenomena one attempts to explain away, however, the less good those explanations appear when looked at cumulatively. If a worldview requires us to explain away too many phenomena that our cognitive faculties tell us are real, then we must reject that worldview because believing it is ultimately self-defeating. Believing it leads or should lead to doubting the reliability of the very cognitive faculties that generate our worldviews. So what I want to do now is just turn to looking at a couple of striking phenomena that I want to suggest could form part of a cumulative case. Again, I wanted to say that there are no knockdown arguments. There's no single argument that establishes the truth of theism or indeed of Christianity. But I want to look at a couple of striking phenomena which I want to suggest are pointers or clues in that direction. So the first is the phenomenon of cosmic fine-tuning. You may have come across this before, but the basic idea is that our universe, the physics of our universe is such that it's balanced on a knife edge, if you like. There are all sorts of things which, if they had been very slightly different, our universe would not have given rise even to galaxies, stars, and planets, which are the preconditions for life emerging. And it's not just that there are one or two of these things. There are maybe 2 or 3 dozen different features or parameters of our universe, which needed to fall within an exceptionally narrow range of all the values they could have had in order for there to be a life-permitting universe. And the thought is that the fact that all of these different variables do have the right values for life to exist, despite the enormous improbability of that, may be a pointer in the direction of an intentionality behind the universe, a mind that intended for a life-permitting universe to exist. Let me just give you 2 examples of cosmic fine-tuning. The first has to do with the strength of gravity. So it's estimated by physicists that if the strength of gravity were different by as small an amount as 1 part in 10 to the power of 60, then there would be no galaxies or stars. Ah, excellent, thanks so much. It was a good test of whether I could remember what was on the slides. So if the strength of gravity had differed in either direction by an absolutely minuscule amount, 1 part in 10 to the power of 60, there could be no galaxies or stars. So just to unpack that a bit, if the strength of gravity had been a tiny bit less, then matter would not have cohered together so as to be able to form galaxies, stars, and planets. If the strength of gravity had been just a tiny bit more, all of the matter in the universe would have collapsed back in on itself almost immediately following the Big Bang. Another example has to do with the way in which energy and matter were distributed in the early universe. That's to say, how evenly or unevenly they were spread throughout the early universe. And basically what physicists have found is that in order to get a universe that has galaxies, you need the matter at the very first moment of the universe to not be perfectly evenly spread. You need it to bunch up very, very slightly. And it's been estimated that out of all of the possible ways in which energy and matter could have been spread out, distributed through the early universe, only an absolutely tiny proportion of all those possible distributions, about 1 in 10 to the power 10 to the power 123, only a very, very tiny proportion of all the possible distributions would allow for the development of galaxies and stars. So if visual analogies help you to get your head around a concept, try to imagine a single grain of sand out of all the world's beaches and deserts. 1 single grain of sand is picked out and is colored red and is put back at random. And then someone tries to, with a blindfold on, recover that 1 red bit of sand. That might be roughly equivalent to the probability that all of these different variables have the right value for a life-permitting universe. This is a gentleman called Fred Hoyle. He was a physicist in the mid-20th century, and he was an atheist, but he remarked upon these discoveries about the fine-tuning of the universe. He admitted that these did not sit well with his atheism, and he remarked that a common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with the physics, as well as with chemistry and biology, and that there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. Okay, let's move on to another consideration. This has to do now with ethics or morality and our ability to have knowledge of ethics. So the first thing to say here is that it may surprise you to know that many philosophers, perhaps a majority of philosophers, including philosophers who are atheists or agnostics, think that ethics is objective. It's not just a matter of human convention or societal consensus at a given point in time. So that's to say that most philosophers who specialize in the field of ethics, including those who don't believe in God, think that ethics is about an objective standard of right or wrong that we are trying to get closer to. So let me just give you sketch out for you three sorts of considerations that incline most philosophers to think that ethics is objective. So the first one is just that it seems overwhelmingly plausible to say that there are some behaviors and practices that are wrong, no matter which culture or time in history they take place in. I think that the very few of us would be willing to give up on the idea that there are some behaviors that are wrong, full stop. Doesn't matter when and where they take place. Things like slavery, or things like forced marriage, or things like child sexual exploitation. It's a really kind of big bullet to bite to say that actually the wrongness of those things is just culturally relative. In fact, the thing that I think before we sort of maybe start rationalizing it, the thing that I think most of us instinctively want to say is that practices such as the examples I just gave are wrong, regardless of which culture they take place in. But if we do want to say that, then we are committed to the idea that there is some objective standard of rightness and wrongness. A second point is that the idea of ethical progress over time, the idea that societies can move in a direction of having better moral, ethical attitudes than previous generations, something I think probably most of us do believe. For example, I think whilst there's still a really long way to go in terms of attitudes towards race in this country, I think it's also true to say that there has been progress in that respect. But here's the key thing. If we really do want to say that there is such a thing as ethical progress, then again, we are implicitly, whether or not we realize it, committed to the idea that there is some objective standard. Because the idea of progress presupposes that there is some standard that we are trying to get closer to, and that this generation is closer to than previous generations. And if there is no objective standard, then all that's happening is that different generations have different moral beliefs. There's nothing better or worse about them. And thirdly, and relatedly, the notion of a moral reformer also presupposes an objective standard. So think of someone like Martin Luther King Jr. or William Wilberforce or Rosa Parks. These were people who took a stand at a place and time when their views were out of sync with society at large. But we now think that Martin Luther King was in the right in his society, even though he was kind of going against the grain. And again, this presupposes that there is an objective standard of rightness and wrongness, that moral reformers are ahead of the curve and they are closer to the truth than the societies that they're trying to reform. So there's more that could be said about that, but let's leave that there for now. So if it's true that ethics is a matter of an objective standard of right and wrong, then there's this question: why think that our minds would be adapted so as to accurately align with ethical truths. And in particular, if it's the case that our minds are the product of a process that is not kind of being guided towards ethical truth, an evolutionary process that is not aiming at ethical truth, why would it be that our minds have ended up being adapted so as to accurately grasp ethical truths? This is an American philosopher called Sharon Street, who has written a very influential paper in 2006, in which she basically tries to argue that, that if it's true that there are objective ethical standards, and yet our minds have been shaped by an unguided evolutionary process, then there really is no reason to think that our minds have ended up being in line with those ethical truths. And I just want to be clear, this is not an argument against evolution. I accept evolution, but this is a question about whether we can make sense of an atheistic universe in which our minds are the products of completely unguided evolution, bringing us into alignment with objective ethical truths. And so Sharon Street says that on this view, allowing our ethical judgments to be shaped by evolutionary influences is analogous to setting out for Bermuda and letting the course of your boat be determined by the wind and the tides. Just as the push of the wind and tides on your boat has nothing to do with where you want to go, so the historical push of natural selection on the content of our ethical beliefs has nothing to do with ethical truth. And so then the thought that I want to leave you with on this point is simply that if it's true that there's a God, if theism is true, then I think there's an easier explanation for how it is that our minds would come into alignment with objective ethical truths. Namely that God wants human beings to have some ethical knowledge. And however God does that, God would set our minds up such that our ethical intuitions are broadly in line with the ethical truth. Now, kind of shifting gears a bit, I've so far only been talking about philosophical reasons for thinking that there might be some kind of intelligence behind the universe. Now, as I said earlier in the interview part, when I was looking into Christianity for myself, I began to become interested not just in philosophical arguments for the existence of God, but also in specific historical data around the person of Jesus. And as I said, something that surprised me was that there actually was some historical data that really needed to be grappled with concerning the fate of Jesus and this claim that Jesus, after he had been crucified, was raised from the dead. And there's a lot to say here, but I think perhaps the easiest way to kind of summarize it briefly is this. There are a list of facts, but I'm just going to focus on three that are accepted by a wide majority of professional historians who study the figure of Jesus. And this is not just historians who happen to be Christian, but historians of any faith background or none. And I think it's worth emphasizing as well, there really is no doubt among professional historians about the existence of Jesus as a historical figure in Palestine in the first century. And so that there is a consensus by the body of professional historians who study Jesus that at least the following three things very likely happened. So the first is that Jesus died by Roman crucifixion. The second, and I think it has to be acknowledged that this one would be a bit more disputed, but nonetheless, a majority of historians today, I think, would accept this, that the tomb in which Jesus was buried was found empty a couple of days after Jesus' crucifixion. And that, by the way, is not to say anything at this point about why the tomb might be empty, just that it was. And the third thing is that Jesus's followers were sincerely convinced that they saw the risen Jesus on a number of occasions, including when they were together as a group. And again, this is not to say anything about why they came to have this sincere conviction, just that they really did. Let me just very briefly kind of allude to some of the reasons why these things are so widely accepted by historians. So it's been said that the crucifixion of Jesus is one of the most solid facts of ancient history, one of the best attested facts. It's attested in maybe 12 different historical sources. And when you bear in mind that many important events in the ancient world were attested by maybe just one or two sources, for example, the eruption of Mount Vesuvius and its destruction of Pompeii, which was a very significant event. We only have, I think, one historical written testimony about that significant event. So perhaps up to 12 distinct sources that attest Jesus' crucifixion. These are three non-Christian ancient sources. I'm not going to read them out. Three non-Christian ancient sources, all of which attest Jesus' crucifixion. As to this claim that Jesus' tomb was found empty, one of the reasons that historians take this very seriously, including historians who are not Christians, is that all four of the Gospels claim that women were the first and primary eyewitnesses of the empty tomb. And the reason that that's significant is that female testimony was held in low regard in the ancient Mediterranean world, including in the ancient Jewish world. And the point is simply that the first Christians and the gospel writers would not be likely to have invented eyewitnesses who would have invited criticism and ridicule. They would have been much more if they were inventing this empty tomb story, they would have been much more likely to say that the eyewitnesses were respected male figures, such as Joseph of Arimathea, the figure who is said to have buried Jesus and who evidently owned the tomb. So why make their lives difficult unless they were telling the truth about what happened? And so again, I'm not going to read out these quotes, but hopefully you can see them. Again, these are quotes from ancient figures around the time of Jesus, both of whom are clearly giving voice to a common sentiment about the value of female testimony. And so again, the point is that a fictional empty tomb story would not have used female eyewitnesses. Now, as for the conviction of Jesus' disciples that they saw Jesus alive again, including when they were together as groups, a key piece of evidence for this, and there are a number of pieces of evidence, but I'll just mention this one, is that in one of the letters by the Apostle Paul, and here I just have to be clear, this is not being treated as scripture by historians, it's just being treated as a document like any other, open to being scrutinized like any other historical document. But there's in that letter, Paul gives a list of witnesses to the risen Jesus. And virtually all historians today agree that this list came directly from the eyewitnesses, that it was given to Paul within a very short space of time after the events, and that Paul himself personally knew the people mentioned in these lists. So this is how the summary goes. It says, "For I handed on to you," and this is Paul writing this letter. He says, "I handed on to you as of first importance what I in turn had received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures." And by that, what he means is that he sees this as Jesus' death as fitting with a pattern that the Old Testament had kind of predicted. That's what he means by in accordance with the scriptures. And that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, which is Peter, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers and sisters at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have died. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me, which is Paul. Now, this is Gerd Ludemann, who is a German New Testament historian and an atheist. But Gerd Ludemann echoes the strong consensus of modern scholarship when he says that all of the elements in this tradition are to be dated to the first 2 years after Jesus' crucifixion. And bear in mind that most of the sources we have for figures in the ancient world, like Alexander the Great, for example, often come decades after the events. And so this is exceptionally unusual to have sources that are so close in time to the events. And Ludemann goes on to say, it may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. So I just want to close then with a quote from this character, a Jewish scholar called Pinchas Lapid, who set out to investigate the data surrounding the alleged resurrection of Jesus, convinced that he would be able to refute this evidence. And this is the conclusion that Pinchas Lapid came to. He says that if the defeated and depressed group of disciples, that's to say defeated and depressed after Jesus had been arrested and crucified, if these disciples overnight could change into a victorious movement of faith, that's to say out in Jerusalem proclaiming Jesus' resurrection, based only on autosuggestion or self-deception, without a fundamental faith experience, then this would be a much greater miracle than the resurrection itself. So what he's saying there is that if this extremely radical transformation of the disciples from a group of people who were in fear for their lives after their friend had been taken from them, arrested, crucified, and so on, if they could have gone from that to people who were out in that same city where Jesus had been crucified and buried, proclaiming his resurrection just a few short days later, he suggests that that if that had come about just by autosuggestion or hallucination or whatever, he thinks that that would be a greater miracle than a resurrection. So I think that I probably have slightly overrun my time already, but I believe that we're going to a short break now. Is that right? Before we have some time for Q&A.
Yeah, we're going to have maybe a 2 or 3 minute break. Just to give people time to give stuff, think questions and put them in. If you want snacks during this period, you can go get them. They're at the back of the room. Sorry, if you're on YouTube, no virtual snacks. So yeah, 3 minute break.
Sorry. 2 different times.
We're just going to get started.
Hi guys, we're going to get started with Q&A. If you can get seated and we're going to start. Great.
There's a lot of
So I think one of the big things that have come through is main a lot of people have this feelings, which is sure, even if we accept this evidence, how can a loving God be in the world of pain and suffering? So how do you reconcile this evidence, whether it be historical, moral, or fine-tuned, with the empirical reality?
Yeah, the reality of evil.
Yes.
I think firstly I want to say the problem of evil is I don't think there's an easy answer to it, and I don't want to be kind of passive. Yeah, I don't want to be blasé about it, and it's something I personally wrestle with a lot. So I said I would try and be as brief as I could. I think I want to say a couple of different things about this. So one is that I think that we can have some, albeit very vague and incomplete and not completely satisfying ideas about the sorts of reasons why a God might allow, at least temporarily, a world which contains adversity and evil and suffering. And the reason I say temporarily is that according to the Christian story, God is not going to be content to leave the world in this condition forever. So, I mean, in very broad terms, two of the types of reasons that God might have for allowing the world to contain adversity and pain and suffering that have been given over the centuries are, one has to do with the significance of our being able to make moral choices between good and evil. And so one dimension of that is that, if we have that power to choose between good and evil, then even God can't make it the case that we always choose that which is good. That would be like creating a square circle, making a free creature choose the thing you wanted to choose would be akin to creating a square circle. It's a logical impossibility, I would want to suggest. And so, yeah, the thought is that God wants human beings to have this capability of making morally significant choices between good and evil, in order that we grow in character, and but not just that. Ultimately, because a loving relationship is one that requires free choice. Now, I want to say, and I'm sure you're already thinking, there are all sorts of shortcomings with this account, not least that there are all kinds of sufferings that don't appear to result from human choices. There's another type of account that's been given over the centuries, which has to do with the idea that it's only in a world that contains adversity and danger and pain and loss and so on that we are able to grow in character virtues. So just think about the virtue of courage. I think we would probably all agree courage is a really good thing for people to have. But then think about how it's possible to acquire courage. It's only possible to acquire courage through being in situations in which there is danger, in the face of which you can be courageous. And so the idea is, and this is sometimes called the soul-making account, the idea is that it's only in a world of adversity, danger, pain, loss, and so on, that things like courage, sacrifice, generosity are possible. It's only in a world like that that we are able to grow in those things. Now, as I already said, I think these are at best kind of vague, fleeting, incomplete glimpses of possible reasons that a God might have for allowing a world like this. The second thing I want to say is that I think that the Christian story brings a unique angle to this, because it doesn't just give us a sort of theoretical framework for thinking about what sorts of reasons God might weigh up and decide that it's worth allowing a world like this in order to achieve certain goods. At the center of the Christian story is the claim that God has descended to us and taken on the form of a human being, that's to say the person of Jesus, and has kind of encountered evil in the first person up close, has experienced the worst that this world has to offer. And when I was exploring Christianity in my late teens, I remember, I mean, of course, I thought often about this question of evil. And I remember one day just having the distinct thought that out of all these religions that claim that there's a God of some sort, I don't think I could believe in any of them except one that says that God knows what it is like firsthand to experience human life, and human life at its worst.
Firstly, a note, we may probably overrun a little bit. So if people would like to leave at 8 o'clock, please do so. Another question that a lot of people are asking is, well, so you said that you believe in evolution and that you don't think Christianity clashes. Could you explain a little more on that? And what about the argument that altruism, that ethics develops as a part of society, of the community building? What would your response be to that?
Yes. Well, I think, a couple of things then. So how do we square evolution with Christianity? And you might say as well, how do we square Christianity with the earth being really old and there having been a big bang and so on? And actually, first thing I want to say is that yes, and there are Christians with a range of different views on this, and so I'm not speaking for all Christians. I just want to make that really clear, and this is just my take on things, and it's fine. There might be Christians here who don't share this view, and that's perfectly fine. So this is just my very kind of tentative take on things. But so why might you in the first place think there was a clash? Well, I think it's because the first couple of chapters of the Bible give an account of how the world came into being, and that account might seem to contradict the details that modern science is giving us. And so I think what I want to say about that is that it's really important to kind of think about the type of literature that Genesis is and what the message is that it is really trying to convey. Is Genesis a kind of manual of the mechanics of the world, the way the world came into being? Or rather, is it trying to tell us some deeper truths about humans and human nature and our place in the universe and our relationship to God? And I think I want to say that it's the latter. Now, so why might it be that that God would allow human beings to have this account of how the world came into being that has all these details that centuries later would be found to be in tension with modern science? What I think I want to say about that is that I think that the picture of God that emerges from the Bible is a God who wants to meet human beings where they're at a particular point in time. And so God is communicating to an ancient people group. It would make no sense. They don't even have the conceptual framework to begin to understand things like DNA and carbon dating and microwave background radiation. Rather, I think that what makes sense is that God would take the kind of images that these people have, the thought world in which they conceptualize, the relationship between themselves and the cosmos they find themselves in, and that God would communicate deep truths about humanity through those images. And what's really interesting is that scholars who have studied the book of Genesis and compared it to other creation accounts in the ancient world, have found that in many ways that the book of Genesis shares much of the kind of thought world with civilizations like Egypt and Babylon and their creation accounts. But what's really interesting is that the book of Genesis puts some really important twists in, and through doing that basically turns those kind of thought worlds on their head to make a completely different. So let me just try and illustrate that a little bit. So in the ancient Babylonian narrative, essentially the gods themselves emerge out of the primordial waters, and so the gods are not kind of ultimate realities. And then the sun, moon, and stars are all deities who are to be worshipped, and human beings are kind of at the bottom of the heap, and they're kind of created almost by accident to serve the gods as slaves. In the book of Genesis, we find all sorts of the same imagery of water and so on, and sun, moon, and stars. But Genesis is is putting a twist on those things in order to basically completely subvert those worldviews that were held by the surrounding nations, so that the sun, moon, and stars, instead of being deities, are just kind of a greater and lesser lamp. For example, the waters are now not kind of the source out of which the gods emerge, but they are just kind of the blank canvas on which God, who already exists and is the ultimate reality, creates. So I could go on about that. The point I want to make is that I think when we start to understand how Genesis works and how it relates to the sort of worldviews of the civilizations surrounding Israel at that time, I think we can see that it is using those images to communicate a deep theological message about who human beings are and their place in the world. And it's not to be understood as a kind of manual for how God created the world. And therefore, I don't see it in conflict with the account that evolution gives, or indeed Big Bang Theory, of the mechanics of how the world came into being.
I guess related to that, one of the questions that have come up is that you say that there's nothing clear-cut in philosophy. There's no knockdown arguments for any particular point of view. Why is it then that so many philosophers are atheists, and so many philosophers are convinced by this view? Does it matter? For example, is Christianity empirically unverifiable? And if so, does it matter?
Well, so the first thing to say about that is that the proportion of theists and Christians in the field of philosophy is much greater than it was a few decades ago. It was probably a tiny percentage in the 50s, when a philosophy called logical positivism was completely dominant. According to recent surveys, something like 15 to 20% of philosophers now are theists, believers in God, and most of those would be Christians. So all that to say, I think appealing to percentages of philosophers who believe one thing or another, I think it's something that's very fluid over time. The other thing is that yes, most philosophers would still be atheists, but the other thing is that most of those philosophers don't specialize in the actual field of philosophy that studies the arguments for and against the existence of God. If you look at that field, and that's known as the philosophy of religion, and then it's probably a lot more balanced, and there may even be a majority of philosophers in that field who believe in God. Now, even then, I think what one could say, well, these percentages are somewhat irrelevant. It's more to do with kind of the sociology of the field at a given point in time. But I do think, yes, I do want to emphasize that the fact that a majority of philosophers may be atheists, I don't think tells us very much, particularly given that most of those philosophers do not specialize in the study of the arguments for and against the existence of God. And moreover, I think, and actually there was an interesting quote from a philosopher called Quentin Smith, who was an atheist philosopher. Sometime in the early 2000s, he remarked that actually, if you put a group of theists who specialize in the philosophy of religion in a room with a bunch of atheists or naturalists who don't, and got them to debate the existence of God, Quentin Smith thinks those theists would have the better of the day. And what he means by that is the theists had really upped their game and were offering arguments of such sophistication that most atheists had not followed this and had kind of fallen behind and were not aware of the fact that these arguments were quite a lot more persuasive than many atheist philosophers had given them credit for. As for, you've mentioned something about verifiability. I mean, that's a slightly tricky notion. I mean, so there was a theory in the philosophy of science that was popular in the early 20th century called logical positivism, or sometimes known as verificationism, the idea that we should only kind of take seriously a theory if there is some empirical observation that would show that theory to be true. Basically, this theory was rejected for a number of reasons, and one being that it self-undermines, because that theory itself, logical positivism, is not verifiable. So there's a sense in which it sort of self-refutes. But then it was also pointed out that many scientific theories are not actually straightforwardly verifiable. It's often a much more complicated matter, because often if an anomaly appears, some piece of evidence that seems to be counter evidence to a given theory, it's hardly ever the case that scientists will immediately abandon it. Often they will start to see, can you build in extra hypotheses to account for that? If it seems like you can and it doesn't add too much complexity, then it might be that you save the theory. So it's a bit more complicated than straightforward. But I do want to say that there are empirical aspects to the case for Christianity.
One last question before we wrap up. Something to note is next Baker-Hytch will be around after the event. So if you have some burning questions, you may stay around. We're going to go to dinner, so please do stay around to ask more questions. But one last question is, if we want to investigate these claims more, in our own time, because we're not always going to have an Oxford philosopher with us, what kind of thing would you recommend?
Yeah, just to keep it really simple, let me recommend just two books. Well, actually one's not that short, but it's a good book. So one is on the philosophical kind of case for theism, and that is a book called Reasonable Faith by an American philosopher called William Lane Craig. And the second one is more on the historical data concerning Jesus and the historical credibility of the Gospels, the biographies of Jesus. And that's a book called Can We Trust the Gospels? It's by a Cambridge scholar called Peter Williams.
Thank you. I think, well, firstly, we'll give a big round of applause.
Great. Just before we let you guys go, do you mind just filling this up? It's a really, really short form. Just want to know how you guys felt about today. Thank you very much.
You won't believe how short it is. Thanks very much for coming.
Thank you very much for having me.
Finished.